This is lecture 108A in the ABCs of Communism series to support volume 7 on communism in Europe. And now we're going to move on to Rome, and the first lecture today is on mature Italian slavery. Rome from an advanced theocratic chiefdom to a kingdom and then a republic. The Roman kingdom occupies the earliest period of Roman history. Then chief executives evolved from chiefs to kings, ruling the city and its territory. Written accounts from the Republican period are based on oral history that fixes the city's founding in 771 BC, when people lived around the Palatine Hill along the Tiber River. The site of the founding of the Roman kingdom had a ford where one could cross the Tiber River. The Palatine Hill and hills surrounding it provided easily defensible positions in the wide, fertile plains surrounding them. In my schema, this time begins when the simple chiefdoms coalesced into one advanced theocratic chiefdom. This ATC had 7 chiefs, later writers described as kings, over the next 243 years. I draw this conclusion because the first kings after the founder Romulus in this legendary history are said to have been elected and relying on religious authority rather than police or military forces. In this sequence, the ATC boss did become a slavocrat boss or king. However, future investigators will have to reconstruct the exact point of transition. We do know that the kingdom ended with the overthrow of the kings and the establishment of the Republic in 509 BC. At any rate, the insignia of the CEOs of Rome were 12 bodyguards called lictors, wielding bundles of wood, rods, surrounding an axe that was called a fasces. The lictors had red shoes, a white jeweled band or diadem around the head, and a purple toga. The name and tradition was the Etruscan protection of judges. The symbolism of the fasces suggests straight through unity because a single rod is easily broken, while a bundle is very difficult to break. In the days of the kingdom, the rods could be used to lash people and the axe to execute them. In the coming of the Republican days, no Roman magistrate could summarily execute a Roman citizen after passage of the laws of the 12 tables. Bundled birch twigs symbolized corporal punishment, as in beating. Now, we're talking about a class-divided, state-organized system. So to begin with, we're going to take a look at banking. And during the Roman Republic, the Roman economy was largely agrarian, centered on the trading of commodities such as grain and wine. Merchant banking was established to facilitate trade. Banks went on to extend credit for worthy persons and to public entities for infrastructure. In the case of crop failure or business downturns resulting in cash shortfalls, banks made bridge loans and began coining money. The First Punic War cost so much that it produced needs for more of this financial innovation. The economy was monetized so that money was used to determine prices and debts. In short, a modern banking system was formed. Emperors issued coinage stamped with their portraits to symbolize their wealth and power, and the Roman imperial economy was unstable, however, inflated in part by emperors who issued money to fund high-profile imperial projects such as public building works. Most importantly, they debased currency to fund wars, and that was just a band-aid, and the empire was headed for destruction. However, long before that, we're talking about a system where, without a central bank to monitor it and regulate the money supply according to economic conditions, the monetized economy was vulnerable to abuse, and the system allowed for exchange of extremely large sums without the physical transfer of coins. In other words, without some hard value gold or silver, fiat money was worthless. There was no central bank. A deposit banker received and held deposits for a fixed or indefinite term and lent money to third parties. As long as capital on hand exceeded the amount needed by borrowers, the bank was healthy. Loans were made and credit was extended on terms with varying degrees of risk. The ruling classes were involved heavily in lending. As creditors and borrowers, they made and received loans from their personal fortunes on terms of their own. Among other dangerous practices, their banks kept less in reserves than the full total of customers' deposits. They had no incentive to always ensure that customers' deposits would be insured in case of a bank run. That antagonistic contradiction, therefore, was inherent in the Roman financial doctrine that held anyone in commerce should have access to credit. Accordingly, fiat money, being the money supply, meant the economy was always on the brink of turbulence. Such needs as meeting the needs of military payrolls were ever present, fueling fiat debasing. Inflation in prices, for a variety of reasons, was also omnipresent, and the credit market endangered. The international trade crisis of the 3rd century AD, consequent disruption of mining operations, resulted in the physical transfer of gold coinage outside the empire when invaders seized it. By AD 300, the fiat money supply failed, and thus the merchant and deposit banking sectors failed. Bankers lost confidence in coins legitimately issued by the central government, and the imperial credit market never recovered. Now we'll go from banking to mining. The slave-labored mining in imperial Rome were done by slavocrat owners in Iberia for Spanish gold, silver, copper, tin, and lead. In France, for gold, silver, and iron. In Britain, for metals like iron, lead, and tin. In the Danubian provinces, for gold and iron. And in the Aegean of Macedonia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, for gold and silver. In Anatolia, for gold, silver, iron, and tin. Now, there are 5 categories of Roman slave labor, one of which was mining. Convicts provided much of the labor in the mines or quarries, where conditions were notoriously brutal. However, there was little division of labor between slave and free, and most workers were illiterate, without special skills. Hydraulic mining was the Roman slavocrat industrialist equivalent to contemporary fracking. They used pressurized streams of water in hushing and ground sluicing to destroy entire mountains in their desperate attempt to get metals. The invention and widespread application of hydraulic mining through hushing and ground sluicing enabled Roman slavocrat caps to start mining operation on a large scale. Hushing means using a torrent of water to reveal mineral veins in prospecting and extraction of ores, and for their exploitation. The de facto pressurized water is very effective in removing overburden and then in extracting the ore, and used by Roman slavocrat caps from the 1st century BC on to the end of the empire. Ground sluicing was the technique used for the mining of natural placers and tailings piles. Naturally flowing of water was used to disintegrate and then transport the material through a sluice, removing the valuable mineral. In any event, it allowed various base and precious metals to be extracted on a scale never matched until the capitalist stage industrial revolution. This intensive large-scale mining of alluvial deposits by open pit and underground shaft went on until AD 225. The next 2 centuries featured widespread slave revolts and equally threatening disaffection of the state apparatus, that is, the legions and the secret police that were needed to keep the slaves at their tasks. Then Imperial Rome West lost the gold mines of Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Moldova, and the Ukraine. Now, the preferred fuel for smelting and metallurgy was wood and charcoal, and, when available, coal. All major coal fields in Roman Britain were exploited by AD 175. Commerce and fuel along the English North Sea coast was profitable. It extended to continental Rhineland, where bituminous coal was used for the smelting of iron ores, as we shall see in the next chapter. And that brings us to the shipyards. Roman sailing vessels navigated the Mediterranean and the Guadalquivir, Ebro, and Rhone, Rhine, Tiber, and Nile rivers. Transport by water was cheaper to move cargo than sending it by land, In any case, building ships meant employing a great number of skilled woodworkers. The port of Rome, Portus, has been uncovered in recent years, and among the reconstructed remains is a massive building close to the distinctive hexagonal basin or harbor at the center of the port complex that dates to the 2nd century A.D. Portus had always been crucial to Rome's development. As trade grew, so did the importance of its port as a gateway linking the kingdom and republic to the Mediterranean. Then, during the imperial period, 27 BC to AD 565, it expanded to include guilds of craftsmen and craftswomen, making all the varied instruments and articles of navigation, as well as basic shipbuilding. And that last date of AD 565 is because of the continuation of this ship construction in Constantinople. The Roman Empire West actually comes to an end in AD 406, as we'll discuss next time. At any rate, the major archaeological excavation shows that it was one of many ports for the storage of imported grain so vital to feeding the city. The major shipyard building measured 475 feet by 200 feet and was about 3 times the height of a modern double-decker bus. Within the building, large brick-faced concrete pillars, some nearly 10 feet wide, supported 8 parallel bays with wooden roofs. The plan of this port authority reminds me of the San Francisco Wharf. At any rate, the main buildings were where officials coordinated the movement of ships and cargo. Archaeology shows that the earliest use was in the building and maintenance of ships for this port. In the Republican period, it was the largest shipyard in Italy and the Mediterranean. A palace and an amphitheater are situated near this shipyard. Portus also contains inscriptions describing a guild of shipbuilders and a mosaic that once adorned the floor of a villa on an ancient road southeast of Rome. It's now on display in the Vatican Museum. This mosaic shows the facade of a building like the one at Portus, with a ship in each bay. A lead investigator says this was a vast structure which could easily have housed wood, canvas, and other supplies, and certainly would have been large enough to build or shelter ships. The scale, position, and unique nature of the building leads us to believe it played a key role in shipbuilding activities, unquote. Now, constructing ships would not have been a problem for the Romans. Among other resources, they had a warship captured during the First Punic War that military intelligence and combat engineering analyzed to learn the latest in Carthaginian shipbuilding. Anyway, from 400 BC onwards, skilled shipbuilding craftsmen of all pay grades were routinely hired. They were recruited from Italian, Greek, and Carthaginian cities by paying such high wages craftsmen could not refuse. Now, roads. Roman road building facilitated land transport and necessitated an associated workforce for constructing vehicles. Communities paid funding money or in-kind taxes. Under Augustus, Rome imposed taxes for providing personnel, animals, and vehicles. Way and relay stations were located along the roads every 7 to 12 Roman miles, and they grew into villages with trading posts. Mansiones were privately owned service stations franchised by the imperial bureaucracy. The support staff at such a facility included muleteers, secretaries, blacksmiths, cartwrights, a veterinarian, and a few military police and couriers. The distance between mansiones was determined by how far a wagon could travel in a day. Mules were the animals most often used for pulling carts that traveled about 4 miles per hour. It took a messenger a minimum of 9 days to travel to Rome from Mainz in the province of Germania Superior. Some taverns along the way offered accommodations as well as food and drink, and wine shops sold wine by the jug for carry-out and by the drink at preferred customer bars. A not unusual tab for a stay would list charges for wine, bread, mule feed, and the services of prostitutes. International trade. Commerce extended as far as China and India. The main cargo was grain. Trade with China was mostly overland through middlemen along the Silk Road. Indian trade occurred by sea from Egyptian ports on the Red Sea. Items traded were olive oil, foodstuffs, especially fish sauce, slaves, metal ores, manufactured metal tools, fibers and textiles, timber, pottery, glassware, marble, papyrus, spices, and drugs, ivory, pearls, gemstones, and wine. Major wine suppliers for Rome were situated on the west coast of Italy, southern Gaul, that is southern France, the Tarraconensis region of Spain, and Crete. Alexandria on the Egyptian coast imported wine from Laodicea in Syria and from the Aegean. The commerce fueled Rome's expansion. Where trade went, so went the army. Emperor Augustus took control of trade and thereby expanded Roman influence by opening new trading markets in overseas areas such as Britain, Germany, and Africa. The Roman economy was able to thrive in the first few centuries AD thanks to its advanced foreign trade and commerce in wine, oil, grain, salt, arms, and iron with other countries. When those countries declined as markets in the 2nd century AD, so did Rome's trade with them. The ruling king and aristocracy held most of Italy that they had turned into a giant slave pen. Slaves cannot buy anything, so overall commerce of basic everyday products declined. Merchants preferred, therefore, a customer base in luxurious products. Therefore, the Roman economy was caught in a vice of declining markets at home and abroad. The contradiction was structural, and without fundamental change, it was one from which there was no escape. As to the professions, inscriptions record 268 different occupations arranged into guilds in the city of Rome and 85 in Pompeii. Professional associations or trade guilds are attested for a wide range of occupations, including fishermen, salt merchants, olive oil dealers, entertainers, cattle dealers, goldsmiths, teamsters, and stonecutters. Only persons who worked in ivory and citrus could be members of one specialist guild. Now, next in agriculture, textile and clothing production employed the most workers. Raw textiles and finished garments were traded wholesale and retail throughout the empire. Brand name products were fashion labels. Businessmen exported off-the-shelf, ready-to-wear clothing. Traveling salespeople, who were mostly freedmen, retailed finished garments. Sometimes peddlers were the merchants themselves. In Egypt, textile producers ran prosperous small businesses employing apprentices. These were free workers earning wages, and slaves setting the common denominator for the wages. The fullers and dye workers had their own guilds, and there were guilds everywhere in the empire for workers who recycled old clothes into new goods. Work performed by slaves fell into 5 general categories. Domestic, with epitaphs recording at least 55 different household jobs. Imperial or public service, secondly. Thirdly, the urban crafts and services. Fourthly, agriculture. And fifth, mining. The greatest number of common laborers was employed in agriculture. In the Italian system of industrial farming, that is latifundia, these were slaves. In the empire outside of Italy, slave farm labor was of primary import in determining the lowest common denominator of technically free people, corresponding to poor white trash in the pre-Civil War U.S. South. In the sample years of AD 100 and 150, Roman per capita GDP ranged from 166 to 380 sesterti coins. That's abbreviated HS. Now, the GDP per capita of Italy was 40 to 66% of that. This was higher than in the rest of the empire because of government payrolls and largesse, incoming tax transfers from the provinces, and the ruling class concentration. The total annual income generated was about 20 billion HS, that is sesterti, with about 5% extracted by central and local government. The top 1% had 20% of the income. Another 20% went to the 10% overseer class. The vast majority of freemen produced more than half of the total income, but lived at subsistence since their wages were determined by the common denominator of slavery costs, which was the food, clothing, housing of slaves costs incurred by the owners. The imperial population was 41 million at the time of Augustus' death in AD 14. Italy was the richest region then, and the next wealthiest province was Egypt. The eastern provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt were about 20% wealthier than their western counterparts, with Egypt alone 28% wealthier. Since the east was where the money was, that is where the ruling families would eventually decide to go. In AD 406, they went there, abandoning the west. The cost of maintaining the state, that is the army and police, in the west was too high. And if you go back to the first volume where we discussed the general crisis of slavery, you'll see that it was the increasingly high cost of the state, that is the army and police, which eventually brought about collapse of old slave stage empires and their transition, where they survived, to the middle ground of feudalism, which is a halfway house between chattel slavery and wage slavery. That cost was paid by taxation at about 5% of the empire's gross product. The typical tax rate paid by individuals ranged from 2 to 5%, and the ruling class did not believe in paying taxes. When the time came that they were the only ones with enough money to pay for the state apparatus, they said, fuck it, and bailed out. The tax code for the freemen was purposely complex, leaving plenty of room to bribe the collectors. Some taxes were paid in cash and some in kind. Taxes were provincial and also levied on industries and crafts. In-kind taxes were accepted from less monetized areas, particularly those who could supply grains or goods to army camps. Polls and property taxes were excessive, encouraging bribery of assessors. Bribery allowed Egyptian farmers to register fields as fallow and tax exempt. There were personal tax obligations for commoners calculated from a census. Each census listed heads of households, and they had to appear before an official and provide a head count of their households, as well as an accounting of all their property suitable for agriculture or habitation. A major source of indirect tax revenue was the Port Authority. It collected customs, tariffs, and tolls on imports and exports, including among provinces. Special taxes were levied on the slave trade. Toward the end of his reign, Augustus instituted a 4% tax on the sale of slaves, which Nero shifted from the purchaser to the dealers, who responded by raising their prices. An owner who manumitted a slave paid a freedom tax, that is calculated at 5% of his value. An inheritance tax of 5% was assessed when Roman citizens above a certain net worth left property to anyone but members of their immediate family. Revenues from the estate tax and from a 1% sales tax on auctions were earmarked for the Veterans Pension Fund. The absence of taxes gave the Roman aristocracy massive increases in their wealth. This boost exceeded the revenues of the central government. An emperor could keep his personal fortune in the form of the government treasury by confiscating the estates of these super-rich aristocrats. Naturally, these families fought back, insisting he take less of a cut from the supposedly public trough. This intra-class war could be downgraded to a dull roar if the underlying causality of insufficient financial resources was overcome. This was an additional reason to get out of Rome and relocate to Constantinople. In 63 BC, the Roman Republic had incorporated the kingdom of Pontus, Cilicia, most of Assyria, the island of Crete, and the kingdom of Judea into its sphere of interest and gotten away with it. The empire was on the horizon. Then, after Pompey's return to Rome as the conqueror of the East, the Roman government's revenues had increased from 50 million denarii to 85 million. New taxes increased government revenue from 200 to 340 million sestertii, meaning Rome simply seized the Egyptian government's budgetary reserve. At the beginning of the reign of Egypt's Pharaoh Ptolemy XII, Auletes in 80 BC, his kingdom's treasury had an annual revenue of 12,500 talents, the equivalent of 75 million denarii, or 300 million sestertii. Accordingly, when Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, there was a massive increase in Roman government revenues. Now, Egyptian revenues in 80 BC had been 7 times the amount of tax money contemporary Roman France, that is Gaul, contributed to the Roman treasury following its conquest by Julius Caesar. That had only been 40 million sestertii. Under Octavian, the Roman treasury collected foreign revenues of 420 million, including 40 million from newly conquered Egypt, 40 million from Gaul, and 340 million from all the other provinces. Roman Britain, after its conquest, produced only about 11 million sestertii in revenue, a paltry sum compared, for example, to the city of Alexandria in Egypt that contributed 36 million sestertii. Gold mining from the Roman Iberia of 80 million sestertii was produced annually. Now, meanwhile, the cost of the state apparatus enforcing the slave system throughout the empire escalated so rapidly that it left far less for the emperor and the other ruling parasites to steal. Roman legions were reduced from 50 to 28, that is, from 500,000 down to 300,000 full-time soldiers and auxiliaries. However, the cost of the army alone was still 640 million sestertii per annum. Out of the 1 billion sestertii total take, that was far too much. The police budget had to be paid and other government expenses added in. That meant the entire 1 billion sestertii was gone. Augustus decided to extend cheap credit to make up for consumer lack of cash resulting from these oppressive massive army and police costs. His idea was to keep the mass of freemen content. To keep this up, which is to say to keep up the increasingly impoverished masses happy, subprime lending became the bedrock of the Augustan financialization policy. Thus, land and real estate prices rose dramatically, and this was, of course, to the benefit of his wealthy and noble latifundista friends. The support of the families, who owned large amounts of property and invested heavily in real estate, were essential to the maintenance of his central regime. Tiberius, as emperor, became aware of the extent of the collusion and realized he had to curb the amount of land that the wealthy owned, as well as control the rapidly inflating money supply. He engaged in heavy austerity policies for the mass of freemen, including ordering all loans to be paid off immediately, and when a debtor could not pay his property, he was foreclosed. Now, as for the state-organized part of this class-divided society, the emerging king was always a military dictator with executive and judicial authority. Ceremonially, the Comitia Curiata handed the CEO authority to the king, kicking off the reign. It provided permanent immunity from judicial reprisal for any acts that he might commit, and handed him complete control of the legions. Along the way, the king assumed the power to appoint all officials to their offices. The king would appoint a tribunus salarum as a de facto prime minister. Technically, he served as the tribune of the Romanist tribe in Rome and was the commander of the king's personal bodyguard, the Salares. The tribune was second in rank to the king, with the power to convene the Curiate assembly and present legislation before it. Another officer appointed by the king was the urban prefect, who acted as the boss of the city, holding all of the king's powers and abilities in his absence. And finally, the king was the only person to appoint patricians to the Senate. The Republican Road. Rome began expanding immediately after the founding of the Republic in the 6th century BC. This had been one of the principal campaign promises of the anti-monarchy coup forces. At first the Italian peninsula that had to be absorbed. This was accomplished by the 3rd century BC. Then the other Italian kingdoms realized that resistance was futile and accepted the inevitable assimilation. Now, a few comments to begin our discussion of the Roman army. It took 300 years to perfect the instrument the coup leaders needed to achieve their dream of what the republic would look like. At least 15 generations for the foundational republic to succeed, in other words. To understand this 3-century period, one needs to understand the Roman army and its developmental history. The details on the structure of the Roman legions and over the millennia of its existence, under whatever Roman government, are in the chapters on Rome. In this lecture that accompanies the appropriate chapters in Volume 7, I want to emphasize several things so you could take them away essential points. First of all slavocrat regimes rely on deadly force to keep slaves in line because slave revolts are inevitable. Police and the army, that is the state, are the principal means of applying ruling class force to maintain labor discipline. Since it is also inevitable that there will be civilian freemen pissed off at one thing or another, it is the state apparatus that is charged with keeping them in line if necessary. In the Roman experience, this is secondly, from the very beginning in 771 BC until the collapse of the Roman Empire West about AD 406, nothing got more attention from the government than did the structure of the army. Thirdly, class, ability, and loyalty were the three principles upon which the table of organization and equipment, TO&E for short, were keyed. What precisely do I mean by these terms? Well, to begin with class. The officer class must come from those with the most interest in maintaining the slavocrat system. That meant officers had to come from the richest families. The second most important military class is the non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, and these first come from the overseer class, those entrusted as bosses over slaves in the field and factory. Ability refers to the individual's talents that need to be assessed in order to best utilize individual scions in whatever rank, and thirdly, the class of petty bourgeois freemen who depend on the government at one or another level for their income. They can also qualify as NCOs. And finally, freemen make up the mass of private soldiers and will vary according to how much death and or injury they are willing to risk in combat. Now, these are qualities to be assessed by what the U.S. military doctrine calls G1, personnel. Now, operations, or G3, is that military administrative unit tasked with planning combat operations, and G4, how the soldiery is to be supplied with food, clothing, shelter, and equipment. Now, point number 5 is that no part of a drill was more essential in action than for soldiers to hold their rank lines. Point number 6, Roman doctrine called for repetitive field training for greatest exactness in combat formation. In other words, forming for combat, the spacing of individual warriors must be such that they do not open the shield wall and yet are uncrowded. Troops too tightly together can never fight, as they should. If their order is too open and loose, they give the enemy an opportunity of penetrating. Whenever this happens, they will be vulnerable to a rear attack. An experienced field officer and or NCO will know this and act accordingly, attempting to create disorder and confusion. Now, that doctrine stressed that recruits should therefore be constantly in the field, drawn up by the roll, and formed into a single rank. They should learn to dress in a straight line and to keep an equal and just distance between man and man. They must then be ordered to double the rank, which they must perform very quickly and instantly to cover their file leaders. In the next place, they are to double again and form 4 deep, and then the triangle, or as it is commonly called, the wedge, a disposition found very serviceable in action. That they must be taught to form the circle or orb For a well-defined empire, for well-disciplined troops, after being broken by the enemy, have thrown themselves into this position and have thereby prevented the total rout of the army. Now, these evolutions, often practiced in the field of exercise, will be easy in execution on actual service. That brings us to a conclusion of this first lecture on the state apparatus in Rome.